The annual St. Mary Mead Flower Show was always a splendid affair, though this year the atmosphere was particularly thick with the scent of damp petunias and a certain social tension that even the brightest sunshine couldn't disperse. The event was held, as it often was, in the sprawling gardens of Gossington Hall. Miss Marple, wearing her sensible tweed suit despite the warmth and a hat adorned with a slightly wilted spray of artificial lilies, sat quietly near the refreshments marquee. Her eyes, as sharp and blue as a winter sky, watched the village inhabitants with the mild, detached interest of a biologist observing a particularly predictable species of beetle. To the casual observer, Jane Marple was merely a frail elderly woman preoccupied with her knitting. In truth, she was cataloguing the small revealing gestures of the crowd, the way Mrs. Bantry's hand trembled as she adjusted her prize roses, the forced joviality in the voice of Dr. Haydock, and the unmistakable, calculating glint in the eyes of the village newcomer, Mr. Alistair Thorne. Mr. Thorne had recently purchased the Cedars and had already managed to irritate nearly everyone with his plans for modernizing the local landscapes. He was currently standing near the tea urn, his voice a booming intrusion into the polite murmurs of the garden party. The centerpiece of the afternoon was the serving of the legendary Earl Grey tea, prepared personally by the vicar's wife, Griselda Clement. It was a tradition that usually signaled the peaceful conclusion of the festivities. As the first tray of delicate porcelain cups was circulated, Mr. Thorne was the first to take a sip, his face twisted into a smirk of self-importance as he prepared to offer an undoubtedly condescending critique. However, the critique never came. Instead, his eyes bulged, his face turned a terrifying dusky shade of violet, and he clutched his throat with a desperate clawing motion. A strangled, gurgling sound escaped his lips before he collapsed forward, his head striking the linen-covered table with a sickening thud. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the clatter of a falling teaspoon and the distant, rhythmic chirping of a cricket. Then the screaming began. Mrs. Price Ridley fainted in a dramatic heap of silk and pearls, while Dr. Haydock rushed forward, his professional mask slipping to reveal a look of profound shock. He checked Thorne's pulse for only a second before looking up at the gathered crowd, his voice grim. The tea, it seemed, had contained something far more potent than bergamot. A man lay dead in the middle of a village festival, and as the scent of almond-bitter cyanide began to drift from the overturned cup, Miss Marple's knitting needles finally stilled. She looked at the abandoned teapot and then at the faces of her neighbours, her mind already sifting through the many reasons why someone might want to stir a final, permanent silence into Alistair Thorne's afternoon tea. The morning following the tragedy at Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead was a hive of frantic, hushed activity. The death of Alistair Thorne, so public and so violent, had acted like a stone thrown into a stagnant pond, sending ripples of fear and excitement into every kitchen and garden. At the post office, which served as the unofficial headquarters for the village's information exchange, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the electric thrill of a shared disaster. Mrs. Price Ridley, having recovered from her fainting spell with remarkable speed, was already leading a choir of speculation. She proclaimed to anyone buying a stamp that the crime was surely the work of a professional assassin, or perhaps a radical from London, for no one in the village would know how to handle such a deadly substance as cyanide. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was in her own garden, meticulously deadheading her geraniums. Her old friend, Mrs. Hartnell, who had arrived breathless with the latest developments, joined her. Mrs. Hartnell's theories were less global than Mrs. Price Ridley's, but far more pointed. She was convinced that the crime was a direct result of Mr. Thorne's controversial plans to divert the village stream for his private water feature. "He was the most provocative man, Jane," she insisted, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He had offended every gardener in the district. To take a man's water rights is to take his soul in this part of the country. I wouldn't be surprised if old Mr. Henderson at the nursery had a hand in it. He has all those chemicals for the greenhouses, you know." Miss Marple listened with the gentle, patient air of someone who had heard 1,000 such stories before. She knew that when people gossip, they reveal far more about their own prejudices than they do about the truth of the matter. "It is a very distressing business, dear," she replied, her scissors making a soft, rhythmic snip. "But it reminds me so much of the time the church warden's daughter thought she had found a burglar because the silver was missing, when in fact it was merely the maid who had hidden it to keep herself from the temptation of selling it." People often look for the most dramatic explanation when the real reason is something much more domestic and, I'm afraid, much more sad. As the day progressed, the village's collective imagination began to settle on the logistics of the poisoning. The fact that Griselda Clement had prepared the tea was a source of great discomfort. No one truly believed the vicar's wife was a murderer, yet the physical reality of the teapot could not be ignored. A rumor began to circulate that the cyanide had been introduced not into the cup, but into the sugar bowl, which would mean that anyone who took sugar was a potential victim. This led to a wave of self-congratulation among those who preferred their tea plain, and a frantic reassessment of who had been standing nearest to the refreshment table during the interval. At the Blue Boar, the conversation was even more cynical. The local men discussed Thorne's financial dealings, which were rumoured to be as murky as the diverted stream. It was whispered that he had made his fortune through a series of ruthless takeovers that had left many people ruined. "He wasn't just a nuisance," one regular muttered over his pint. "He was a predator. He came here thinking he could buy the village and everyone in it. Someone just decided to stop the sale before it went through." This theory of financial revenge was popular, as it allowed the villagers to maintain their sense of being the aggrieved party, while shifting the actual guilt onto a shadowy figure from Thorne's past. Miss Marple, observing the flow of people past her gate, noticed how the village was already beginning to protect itself. By creating these elaborate theories of outsiders and grand financial conspiracies, they were avoiding the uncomfortable truth that the killer had likely stood among them, laughing at the same jokes and admiring the same roses. She saw the way Dr. Haydock walked with his head down, looking troubled by more than just a medical failure. She saw the vicar's wife looking out of her window with a pale, haunted expression. To the rest of St. Mary Mead, the village was reacting to a scandal. To Miss Marple, it was a community beginning to realize that the poison wasn't just in the tea, but in the very air they breathed. She sat on her bench, her mind sifting through the noise, waiting for the one quiet fact that would contradict all the loud theories currently being traded over garden walls. The arrival of Inspector Slack was much like the sudden sharp gust of a north wind that threatens to scatter one's freshly raked autumn leaves. He was a man of intense, almost aggressive vitality, possessing a mind that functioned like a steel trap, though Miss Marple often felt it was a trap that snapped shut a trifle too quickly on the wrong tail. He descended upon Gossington Hall with a team of grim-faced subordinates, immediately cordoning off the refreshment marquee, and treating the delicate lace tablecloths as if they were maps of a battlefield. To Slack, the murder of Alistair Thorne was a matter of logistics and chemistry. He was obsessed with the how of the poison and the when of the serving, convinced that a sufficiently rigorous interrogation of the vicar's wife would yield a tidy chronological solution. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained on the periphery of the official activity, appearing to be deeply concerned with the progress of her knitting. Yet her eyes were far busier than her fingers. She sat on a garden bench that provided a clear view of the tea tent, watching the suspects as they were summoned one by one for questioning. She observed the way Griselda Clement kept twisting her wedding ring, a gesture not of guilt, she felt, but of a woman who was profoundly offended that her hospitality had been turned into a weapon. She also watched young Jerry Burton, the local estate agent, who was pacing near the rose beds with a restlessness that seemed to go beyond mere shock. Jerry had been Thorne's primary contact for the purchase of local lands, and he looked like a man who had suddenly seen his commission, and perhaps his reputation, vanish into thin air. The inspector's early investigation focused almost entirely on the teapot. It was a large silver vessel, an heirloom of the Bantry family, and it had been filled and refilled several times throughout the afternoon. Slack was confused by the fact that several other people had drunk from the same pot without ill effect. He began to theorize that the poison must have been placed directly into Thorne's cup, which implied a terrifyingly bold act of sleight of hand in front of dozens of witnesses. He spent hours questioning the servers, looking for a hand that had lingered too long, or a person who had positioned themselves strategically behind the guest of honor. "It is quite remarkable," Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Bantry as they sat in the latter's morning room, "how the police always look for the most difficult way to do a thing. They treat it like a conjuring trick at a party. But in my experience, the most effective way to hide something is to put it exactly where everyone expects to see something else. It reminds me of the time the old sexton thought his boots had been stolen because they weren't on his porch, when in fact he had simply put them on the wrong feet and walked into the garden without noticing. One's expectations can be a very powerful blindfold." Miss Marple was particularly interested in a detail that the inspector had dismissed as trivial: the sugar bowl. While the police were testing the tea leaves, she had noticed that the small silver tongs were resting on the table rather than in the bowl. Furthermore, she had observed that Mr. Thorne, a man of notoriously indulgent habits, had taken 3 large lumps of sugar, whereas most of the other guests had taken none, or perhaps 1. She also noted a curious absence: the small blue-bordered silk handkerchief that Mr. Thorne had been using to mop his brow just moments before he collapsed. It was nowhere to be found in the vicinity of the table. She began to think about the nature of the poison itself. Cyanide was a substance of finality and speed, but it was also a substance with a very distinct bitter odor. In the open air of a garden, with the scent of roses and the steam of hot tea, such a smell might be masked, but only for a moment. This suggested to Miss Marple that the killer was not just bold, but someone who understood the sensory distractions of a large crowd. She watched as Dr. Haydock left the hall, his face etched with a fatigue that seemed to stem from a deeper source than a single death. He had been Thorne's physician, and Miss Marple wondered exactly what secrets the doctor might be carrying in his black bag, secrets that Thorne might have been using as a lever. While the inspector measured the distance between the chairs, Miss Marple was measuring the distance between the villagers' public faces and their private fears. She sat in the fading afternoon light, her mind sifting through the behavior of the mourners, looking for the one person whose grief was just a fraction too rehearsed. The following morning, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had shifted from a state of collective shock to one of grim, almost eager resolution. Inspector Slack, a man who believed that a mystery was merely a poorly organized set of facts, had found his victim for the scales of justice. The obvious suspect had emerged in the form of young Jerry Burton, the estate agent. The evidence, as presented by Slack to a hushed gathering at the local constabulary, appeared to be a masterpiece of circumstantial tidiness. It was discovered that Burton had been embroiled in a disastrous land speculation deal, one that Thorne had intended to expose to the local board, a move that would have resulted in Burton's professional ruin and likely a prison sentence for fraud. Furthermore, a search of the pockets of Burton's tweed jacket, which he had left draped over a chair in the tea tent, revealed a small empty glass vial that still bore the faint, telltale scent of bitter almonds. To Slack, this was the equivalent of a smoking gun. He theorized that Burton, acting in a moment of cold-blooded desperation, had dropped the poison into Thorne's cup while leaning over to discuss a map of the diverted stream. The motive was clear. The means were found in his possession, and the opportunity was verified by half a dozen witnesses who had seen him speaking to the deceased just moments before the collapse. By noon, Jerry Burton was being driven away in a police car, his face a mask of bewildered, stammering protest that the village interpreted as the fumbling of a guilty man. Miss Marple, however, remained profoundly unconvinced. She sat in her parlour with a glass of her own homemade cowslip wine, her expression one of mild, troubled contemplation. She had watched the arrest from her window. While the village had seen a criminal caught, she had seen a young man whose incompetence in a crisis made him an unlikely candidate for a master poisoner. Jerry Burton was the sort of young man who frequently lost his car keys and forgot his own sister's birthday. The idea of him executing a precise public assassination with a chemical as volatile as cyanide seemed to her to be a fundamental mismatch of character. "It is all so very neat, isn't it?" she remarked to Mrs. Bantry, who had dropped by in a state of high agitation. The vial in the pocket, the public motive, the convenient witnesses. "It reminds me so much of the time the old gardener at the Grange was accused of stealing the silver because it was found in his potting shed." Everyone forgot that the potting shed had no lock and that the gardener had been blind in one eye for 10 years. When a piece of evidence is left exactly where it is most likely to be found, I always find myself wondering who wanted it to be found there. Mrs. Bantry blinked, her tea cooling in her hand. "But Jane, the vial!" He couldn't explain how it got there. He just kept saying he'd never seen it before in his life, and Thorne was going to ruin him. People do desperate things when they are cornered. Desperate things, yes, Miss Marple agreed, her knitting needles picking up a brisk, determined pace. But usually they are messy things. A man like Jerry, if he were to kill, would likely have used a heavy object in a dark alley, or perhaps a clumsy pushed from a height. To use cyanide at a garden party requires a level of theatrical timing and a steady hand that Jerry simply does not possess. He is a boy who spills his tea even when it isn't poisoned. No, this has the feel of an arrangement. It is a stage set, Dolly, and the police are merely the audience that the real killer has invited to watch the performance. Miss Marple's mind turned instead to the missing blue-bordered handkerchief and the curious position of the sugar tongs. She remembered the way Thorne had reached for the sugar, his movements heavy and slightly laboured even before he took a sip of the tea. She also thought of the village newcomer, Mr. Thorne himself, not as a victim, but as a man who had made a profession of knowing other people's secrets. If he had been pressuring Jerry Burton, it was highly probable he had been pressuring others as well. The question was, who among the many people with a reason to hate him had the cold, surgical precision to plant a vial in a coat pocket while the world was looking the other way? As the shadows of the late afternoon stretched across her garden, Miss Marple realized that the arrest of Jerry Burton was not the end of the case, but the successful completion of the killer's first act. The real danger was that the inspector was so satisfied with the obvious that he had stopped looking for the truth. The following morning Miss Marple found herself standing once more in the gardens of Gossington Hall, though the festive air of the flower show had been replaced by a sombre, clinical stillness. The police had removed the silver tea service, yet the long table still stood under the marquee, covered in a white linen cloth that seemed to stare back at her like a blank sheet of paper. Inspector Slack was elsewhere, presumably documenting the confession he expected to wring out of Jerry Burton, which left the grounds in the temporary care of a young constable who was easily distracted by the prospect of a sandwich in the kitchen. Miss Marple, appearing as nothing more than a frail old lady searching for a lost knitting bag, began a meticulous survey of the area immediately surrounding the guest of honour's chair. She was not looking for a vial or a weapon. She was looking for a pattern of movement. Her eyes travelled over the grass, noting the slight indentations where the heavy table legs had pressed into the turf. It was then that she saw it, not on the table, but caught in the thorny embrace of a nearby rose bush, about 10 feet from where Alistair Thorne had collapsed. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, and it bore a faint, waxy texture. She retrieved it with the aid of her umbrella handle, her fingers trembling slightly with a mix of age and focused intensity. It was a small, discarded wrapper from a specific brand of throat lozenge, the kind favored by those who suffer from persistent dry coughs. To any other observer, this would be mere litter, but to Miss Marple, it was a profound anomaly. She remembered vividly that Thorn had been speaking with a booming, resonant voice all afternoon. He had shown no sign of a cough or a sore throat. Furthermore, she recalled that as the tea was being served, Thorn had reached into his waistcoat pocket and popped something into his mouth. Not a lozenge, she now realized, but something he had been led to believe was a routine medication or perhaps a digestive aid. She leaned down further, her spectacles sliding to the bridge of her nose, and spotted a second, even smaller detail. Pressed into the damp earth beneath the rosebush was a single tiny silver-colored bead. She picked it up and held it to the morning light. It was not a bead from a necklace, but rather a small, spherical, sugar-coated pill, the sort used by pharmaceutical companies to mask the bitter taste of potent medicines. This one, however, had been crushed under a heel. Even now it emitted a faint, haunting scent of bitter almonds. The truth began to crystallize in her mind with the terrifying clarity of a chemical reaction. The poison had not been in the teapot, nor had it been dropped into the cup by a fumbling Jerry Burton. It had been administered in the form of a pill, presented as something harmless, perhaps a heart tablet or a vitamin, given to Thorn by someone he trusted implicitly just before the tea was served. This discovery explained the lack of other victims and the silence of the bang that Slack was so desperately chasing. The tea was merely the vehicle to provide a public setting for a private execution. The killer had known Thorn's daily habits, his reliance on certain medications, and his vanity regarding his health. They had switched a harmless pill for a deadly one, knowing that the onset of cyanide is rapid and would be attributed to the tea he was about to drink. The crumpled lozenge wrapper was the discarded camouflage used to handle the deadly capsule without direct contact. Miss Marple tucked the crushed pill fragment into a clean handkerchief, her mind racing through the village inhabitants who had proximity to Thorn's personal medical regime. She thought of Dr. Haydock, who had been Thorn's physician, and of the local chemist, Mr. Cherrington, who was known to be a man of meticulous records and secret debts. She also remembered the way Thorn's own daughter, a quiet girl with haunted eyes, had stood by the refreshment table with a look of intense, frozen expectation. The clue was not in the tea, but in the trust Thorn had placed in someone close to him, a trust that had been used to lead him to the slaughter in full view of his neighbours. As she walked back toward her cottage, Miss Marple realized that the inspector was hunting a ghost in a teapot, while the real killer was likely sitting at a breakfast table, watching the clock and waiting for the news of Jerry Burton's formal indictment to finalize their triumph. The afternoon sun began to cast long skeletal shadows across the village green, a sight that usually brought Miss Marple a sense of peace but today only served to highlight the jagged edges of the community's collective anxiety. With the physical evidence of the silver pill fragment safely tucked away, she turned her attention to the more complex task of dissecting the social history of the Thorn household. Experience had taught her that a man like Alistair Thorn did not simply arrive in a village and begin diverting streams without having diverted a great many lives in his past. She decided to pay a visit to the local library, not for a book, but for the company of Miss Weatherby, who had managed the village archives for 40 years and possessed a memory like a meticulously kept ledger of every scandal within a 50-mile radius. "He was not always a Thorn, you know," Miss Weatherby whispered, leaning across the mahogany desk until the scent of peppermint and old paper was quite overwhelming. Before he made his fortune in those dreadful industrial mergers, he was known as Alistair Vance, a name associated with a rather spectacular bankruptcy in the north. There was a partner involved, a younger man who took the blame and disappeared into the merchant navy. It was said that Thorne, or Vance as he was then, had systematically siphoned off the company's pension fund to build his initial capital. He was a man who built his palaces on the ruins of other people's lives, Jane. It's a habit that tends to catch up with a person, even in a place as quiet as St. Mary Mead. This revelation provided the missing context for the cold, calculating nature of the crime. Miss Marple thought of the people who had recently arrived in the village, looking for a fresh start or perhaps a late reckoning. She then turned her steps toward Dr. Haydock's surgery. The doctor was a man of immense kindness, but as Miss Marple sat in his waiting room, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The nurses were speaking in hushed tones, and the doctor himself appeared at the door with a face that looked as though it had been carved from grey stone. He had been Thorne's primary care physician, and it was common knowledge that Thorne was a demanding, litigious patient who treated his health as another asset to be managed by threats of legal action. He was a man who lived on the edge of a heart attack for years. Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock admitted when they were finally alone. He refused to follow a regime, yet he blamed his doctors for every palpitation. He was obsessed with a new experimental treatment from Switzerland, small, silver-coated capsules that he insisted on taking before every meal to aid his digestion. I told him they were unnecessary, but he wouldn't listen. He even had them delivered to the local chemist, Mr. Cherrington, to be repackaged into smaller doses. He was a man who didn't trust anyone, and yet he was entirely dependent on the very people he insulted. This mention of Mr. Cherrington, the chemist, added a third thread to the tapestry. Cherrington was a man of quiet, almost invisible habits, yet he held the keys to every medicine chest in the village. Miss Marple recalled that Cherrington's own father had been ruined by a financial collapse decades ago, a collapse that bore a striking resemblance to the Vance bankruptcy mentioned by Miss Weatherby. The relationships in St. Mary Mead were no longer a simple matter of neighbourly affection. They were a web of historical betrayals. There was the doctor, weary of being bullied, the chemist, perhaps seeking a long-delayed restitution for his family's honour, and Thorne's own daughter, Elspeth, who had spent her life as a virtual prisoner to her father's whims and his fluctuating temper. Miss Marple realized that the murder was not just a response to the diverted stream, but a surgical strike against a man who had become a monster of his own making. Thorne had been surrounded by people who had every reason to wish him dead, and he had provided them with the perfect tool by his public obsession with his silver pills. The mystery was no longer about who had access to the tea, but who had access to the pharmacy. As she walked home, passing the darkened windows of the Cedars, Miss Marple felt the weight of these hidden secrets pressing down on the village. Everyone had a past, and everyone had a motive, but only one person had the cold, patient precision to wait for the flower show to enact their revenge. She sat by her fire that evening, her needles clicking a slow, mournful rhythm, knowing that the obvious guilt of Jerry Burton was merely the curtain that the killer had drawn over a very old and very dark account. The following morning, the fragile equilibrium of St. Mary Mead was shattered not by another death, but by a revelation that seemed to turn the entire investigation into a hall of mirrors. Just as Inspector Slack was preparing his final brief against Jerry Burton, a second confession arrived, not in person, but in the form of a typed letter delivered to the local constabulary. The letter was unsigned, yet it contained details about Alistair Thorne's financial past that only an intimate associate could have known. It claimed that the cyanide had not been intended for Thorne at all, but was meant for a shadowy accomplice whom Thorne was meeting in the tea tent to discuss the final siphoning of the village land funds. This sudden shift from a crime of local resentment to a plot of international embezzlement sent the inspector into a state of frantic, redirected energy. Miss Marple, hearing of the letter through the rapid-fire delivery of the milkman, did not join in the general sense of excitement. She recognized the letter for what it was, a masterfully executed piece of misdirection designed to widen the field of suspects, just as it was beginning to narrow. If the poison was meant for an accomplice, then Jerry Burton's motive was invalidated, and the focus shifted toward a world of phantom financiers that simply did not exist in the reality of the village. The twist was a clever one, reinforcing the true killer's deception by providing a more glamorous London-style motive that would naturally appeal to a man of Inspector Slack's ambitions. It allowed the killer to remain in the shadows while the police chased ghosts in the counting houses of the city. While the inspector was busy telegramming Scotland Yard, Miss Marple decided to visit the local chemist's shop, ostensibly to purchase a new bottle of lavender water. Mr. Cherrington was behind the counter, his movements as precise and measured as a clockwork toy. He was a man who lived in a world of grains and drams, yet as Miss Marple watched him, she noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands as he handled a glass beaker. The shop was quiet, the air smelling of menthol and dried herbs, but the tension was as thick as a winter fog. "It is quite remarkable, isn't it, Mr. Cherrington?" she said, her voice dropping into its most innocent conversational tone, "how a single drop of something can change the entire nature of a substance." "I was thinking of poor Mr. Thorne and those silver pills he was so fond of. He mentioned once that he found the taste quite distinctive, almost like bitter almonds. He thought it was the Swiss formula, poor man. He had such a touching faith in the power of a label." Cherrington's face did not change, but his eyes became suddenly sharply focused. "Labels are the only thing that prevent chaos in a pharmacy, Miss Marple. Without them we would be no better than the medieval poisoners. Mr. Thorne was a man who respected labels, though I believe he often misread the people behind them. As for the letter the police received, I'm sure it's just the work of a crank. Everyone wants to be part of a tragedy, provided they aren't the ones in the box." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, her blue eyes never leaving him. "But a crank wouldn't know about the Vance bankruptcy, would they? Or about the way a certain silver coating can hide the scent of cyanide just long enough for it to be swallowed during a cup of tea. It reminds me so much of the time the old schoolmaster thought he had found a rare manuscript in his attic, only to realize that the ancient ink was actually a brand sold only by his own brother. The truth has a way of being very local, no matter how much we try to make it look grand." As she left the shop, Miss Marple noticed a small black car parked discreetly around the corner. It belonged to Dr. Haydock, but the doctor was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she saw Thorne's daughter, Elspeth, sitting in the passenger seat, her face a mask of exhaustion and grief. This new revelation, the alliance between the doctor and the daughter, added a final complicating layer to the mystery. Had they collaborated to free themselves from Thorne's tyranny, using the chemist's historical grudge as a shield, or was the chemist acting alone, using the daughter's proximity to the medicine cabinet to stage his final revenge? The twist of the anonymous letter had succeeded in confusing the police, but for Miss Marple it had served only to highlight the desperation of the perpetrator. The killer was no longer just protecting their freedom, they were fighting to maintain the narrative of the crime. She walked home slowly, her mind settling on the one test that would force the actor to miss their cue and reveal the true face behind the mask of village respectability. The following afternoon, the air in St. Mary Mead was thick with a humid, expectant stillness that often precedes a summer thunderstorm. Miss Marple, however, appeared entirely unaffected by the atmospheric tension as she made her way toward the small, immaculately kept cottage of Mr. Cherrington, the village chemist. She did not seek him out at his place of business, where professional armor of white coats and glass counters might provide him with a sense of security. Instead, she chose the intimacy of his private garden, a place where he spent his evenings cultivating medicinal herbs with a devotion that bordered on the obsessive. She found him near a patch of foxglove, his pruning shears moving with the same surgical precision he applied to his prescriptions. "It's a beautiful afternoon for gardening, is it not, Mr. Cherrington?" Miss Marple began, her voice as soft as the hum of the nearby bees. Though I find that digitalis can be such a temperamental plant, it requires such a steady hand to ensure it remains a cure rather than a catastrophe. It reminds me so much of a young man I once knew in St. Mary Mead, the son of a local clockmaker actually. He was a master of intricate mechanisms, but he became so obsessed with the idea of a perfect silent strike that he forgot that even the smallest gear leaves a mark on the frame. Cherrington did not look up from his work, but the rhythm of his shears stuttered for a fraction of a second. Mechanisms are reliable, Miss Marple. It is the human element that is prone to failure. Mr. Thorne, for instance, was a man who believed he could control the gears of this village as if it were his own private watch. He failed to realize that some springs, when wound too tight, eventually snap. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed, stepping closer to the flower bed. She reached into her pocket and produced the small, crushed fragment of the silver pill she had found beneath the rosebush. She did not hand it to him. She merely held it on her open palm, where it glinted like a malevolent star. I found this near the tea tent. It is a curious thing, but Dr. Haydock mentioned that these silver-coated capsules were a specialty order. He said they were designed to mask the bitterness of the contents. I imagine it would take a very skilled hand to open such a delicate shell, replace the digestive aid with a lethal dose of cyanide, and then reseal it so perfectly that even a suspicious man like Alistair Vance would not notice the difference. At the mention of the name Vance, Cherrington's entire posture became rigid. He finally looked at her, his eyes cold and hollow, like deep wells that had long ago run dry. Vance died a long time ago, Miss Marple. He died in a boardroom in the north, along with the reputations of better men. The man who died at the flower show was merely a ghost wearing a different name, a ghost who still held the records of his old crimes, I suspect, Miss Marple countered gently, and a ghost who was threatening to use those records to ruin a new generation. You see, I was looking at the village archives with Miss Weatherby. It is remarkable how the signature on a certain bankruptcy document from 30 years ago matches the handwriting on the anonymous letter sent to the inspector yesterday. The letter was a very clever bit of stagecraft, Mr. Cherrington. It sought to turn a local act of justice into a grand financial conspiracy. It was the act of a man who spent his life thinking in grains and dreams, trying to weigh his own revenge against the safety of his future. She watched him closely, her mind a steel trap waiting for the snap. She wasn't looking for a frantic denial. She was looking for the reaction of a man who had spent his life being invisible. "You didn't plant the vial in Jerry Burton's pocket because you hated the boy," she whispered. "You did it because you knew the inspector would find it exactly where you put it. You used the boy as a distraction, just as you used the tea as a cover. But the pill was the one thing you couldn't control once it was swallowed. It left a trail in the earth, and it left a scent in this garden that even the lavender cannot hide." Cherrington looked down at his shears, his knuckles white. The psychological game was reaching its crescendo. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, a frail figure in a tweed suit who had just dismantled a lifetime of careful concealment. She wasn't an inquisitor, she was merely a mirror reflecting the truth. "The inspector is currently tracing the typewriter used for that letter," she added, a final gentle pressure. "He believes it will lead to a London office, but I think he will find it tucked away in the back of a chemist's shop, right next to the ledger of a family that never forgot what Alistair Vance took from them." The chemist said nothing, but the shears in his hand began to tremble, and for the first time, the mask of the precise professional began to crumble. The following morning, the residents of St. Mary Mead were summoned to the morning room of Gossington Hall by a request that bore the unmistakable weight of a final verdict. Inspector Slack was present, appearing remarkably disgruntled that his investigation into the London financial markets had been interrupted by what he termed village trifles. while Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock stood by the window in an expectant, heavy silence. Miss Marple sat in her usual upright chair, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, inexorable rhythm that seemed to measure the passing seconds. The suspects were gathered like a cast awaiting a final critique, their faces pale under the morning sun streaming through the leaded glass. "It is a fascinating thing about the human mind," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "We are so easily led by the spectacle of the moment. We saw a man collapse at a tea table, and because the tea was the most obvious thing in front of him, we assumed the tea was the vessel of his death. We saw a vial in a young man's pocket, and because it was a convenient piece of evidence, we assumed it was the truth. But in a village like ours, truth is seldom found in loud public moments. It is found in the quiet historical resentments that simmer for decades before they finally boil over." She paused, looking kindly at Jerry Burton, who had been brought from the station for the meeting. "Jerry did not kill Alistair Thorne. He is a boy who can barely manage his own affairs, let alone orchestrate a murder that requires the precision of a master craftsman." Inspector Slack cleared his throat aggressively. "The vial, Miss Marple, the motive. The land deal was a matter of public record." "The land deal was a distraction, Inspector," she replied, her gaze shifting toward the back of the room. "The motive was far older and far deeper. It was a motive born of a family's ruin and a son's determination to restore an honor that had been stolen by a man named Alistair Vance. You see, the murder did not take place in the teapot. It took place in a pharmacy. The poison was not in the tea, but in one of those silver-coated digestive pills that Mr. Thorne was so fond of taking. The killer knew that Thorne would swallow the capsule just before the tea was served, ensuring that the effects would be attributed to the festivities. It was a brilliant piece of theatrical timing, using the most public setting to commit the most private of acts." She stood up slowly, her eyes resting on Mr. Cherrington, the chemist, who stood near the door with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "You were the only one with the skill to open those delicate shells and reseal them, Mr. Cherrington. You were also the only one who knew the true identity of Alistair Vance, because your own father had been his victim 30 years ago. When Thorne arrived in the village, boasting of his wealth and his plans, he was rubbing salt into an old wound. But when he began pressuring you for illegal access to certain controlled substances, you realized that he hadn't changed, he was still a predator, and you decided to be the one who finally stopped the hunt." A collective gasp moved through the room, but Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. "The anonymous letter you sent to the inspector was your final mistake. You tried to make the crime look like a grand financial conspiracy to lead the police away from the village. But the typewriter you used has a slightly misaligned E, the very same E that appears on the prescription labels you have printed for me for years. And then there was the pill fragment I found in the rosebush. It had been crushed under your heel when you stepped away from the table, leaving a scent of bitter almonds that the garden's perfume could not hide. You planted the vial on Jerry Burton because you needed a local scapegoat to satisfy the inspector's need for an immediate arrest, but you forgot that a boy like Jerry doesn't know the first thing about cyanide. The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Cherrington did not move, but his face seemed to sag, the mask of the precise professional finally dissolving to reveal the tired, broken man beneath. He did not deny it, he simply looked at his hands, the hands that had spent a lifetime measuring out cures and had finally measured out a death. Inspector Slack, realizing that his London leads were indeed ghosts, signaled to his men. As the chemist was led away, the villagers remained frozen, the reality of the deception slowly sinking in. The flower show was over, the mystery of the tea was solved, and Miss Marple, ever composed, picked up her knitting once more. She had seen the pattern behind the chaos, and the truth, however bitter, had finally been served. The following week in St. Mary Mead arrived with a peculiar, heavy stillness, as if the village were collectively holding its breath after a long and exhausting ordeal. The yellow police tape that had cordoned off the refreshment marquee at Gossington Hall was gone, leaving only flattened patches of grass that would take weeks of rain and sun to recover. The flower show was now a memory, but one that tasted of ash rather than the sweet perfume of prize-winning lilies. At the post office, the gossip had not ceased, but it had shifted in tone. There was less excitement now and more of a sombre, reflective quality. The residents walked a little more slowly, and when they met one another's gaze over a garden hedge, there was a fleeting moment of hesitation, as if they were all wondering what other secrets might be buried beneath the tidy flower beds of their neighbours. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm golden glow over her lavender bushes. She was engaged in the delicate task of winding a fresh skein of soft grey wool, her movements rhythmic and purposeful. From her vantage point she could see the distant spire of the church and the quiet lane that led to the chemist's shop. The shop was closed now, its windows dark, the jars of coloured waters standing like silent sentinels over an empty counter. Mr. Cherrington had been removed to the county jail, and the village was left to grapple with the reality that the man who had provided their cures for 30 years was the same man who had introduced a lethal poison into their most cherished social event. It was a paradox many found hard to swallow. Mrs. Bantry arrived at the gate, looking more tired than Miss Marple had ever seen her. She did not burst with news today. Instead, she sat quietly on the garden bench, watching a white butterfly dance over the foxgloves. "It's the quietness that I find so unsettling, Jane," she said eventually, her voice barely a whisper. "To think that Mr. Cherrington sat in that shop day after day, year after year, nursing such a terrible grudge. He was always so polite, so precise. It makes one feel that one doesn't really know anyone at all. We see the labels we put on people, the chemist, the doctor, the vicar, but we never really see the person behind the counter." Miss Marple tucked the end of the wool into the ball and looked at her friend with a gaze of profound maternal pity. "People are so very much like gardens, Dolly. We see the blooms and the well-kept paths, but we often forget the roots that go down deep into the dark earth." Mr. Cherrington was a man who lived entirely in the past, feeding a resentment that should have been allowed to wither long ago. He thought he was enacting justice for his father, but in truth he was merely building a prison for himself. It is a very sad thing when a person allows a single act of betrayal to define the rest of their lives. It poisons the soil, you see, and eventually nothing healthy can grow there. The conversation turned briefly to Jerry Burton, who had been fully exonerated and had recently left the village for a long holiday in the south of France. His departure was seen as a sign of his recovery, though Miss Marple suspected he would always carry a certain wariness of silver tea services and public praise. Thorne's daughter, Elspeth, had also disappeared from the village, having inherited her father's vast and troubled estate. There were rumours she intended to sell the Cedars and move abroad, a decision that Miss Marple felt was both wise and necessary. The house held too many ghosts, and the village, for all its charm, could be a very difficult place for someone associated with a public scandal. As the sun began to dip behind the elms, casting long purple shadows across the grass, Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The grey wool was beginning to take shape, row by row, stitch by stitch. The world was a place of infinite complexity and often of great sorrow, but she found a certain comfort in the predictability of human nature. She understood that while the settings might change, from a theatre to a vicarage to a garden party, the motivations remained the same. Fear, greed, and the desire for revenge were the constants of the human condition, but so too were the small acts of kindness and the persistent search for the truth. She went into her house as the first evening star appeared, a small, solitary figure who had once again seen through the facade to the reality beneath. The curtain had fallen on the tragedy of the silver pill, and Miss Marple was content to let the silence return to St. Mary Mead.